This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. This episode is produced in partnership with the Elizabeth and Tony Comper Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism and Racism at the University of Haifa. My guests today are two fellows of the Comper Center. One is a Hungarian-born sociologist and philosopher, and the other is a historian specializing in Israel and American Jewry. Today we are going to discuss the subject of Jews and whiteness, in inverted commas, which has gained a great deal of traction in the West by proponents and critics alike. Dr. Balazs Berkovits, Dr. Sara Hirschhorn. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi.
Hi, Gilad. Thank you for having us on.
Thank you.
So let's start with you, Balazs. Why has whiteness become so prominent in the context of the place that Jews occupy in racial politics?
Yes, I think the whiteness concept is extremely important. And we in the Comper Center, we are trying to unearth the roots and sources of contemporary anti-Semitism and also anti-Zionism. And I think one of the main elements is really whiteness and the tagging of Jews as white, because the whiteness concept has become something that designates, that describes and interprets dominance in contemporary society. So whenever people or ethnic groups, minority groups are tagged as white, then it automatically means that they are not a minority anymore. Furthermore, that they are susceptible to becoming dominant in society. So the whiteness tag, what it does is that it designates a minority group, an evolution from this minority position to a position of dominance. And there's been a lot of talk on whiteness in critical whiteness studies, especially. And in this kind of framework, whiteness is not being understood as skin color, but more as a social position, as the endpoint of acculturation, assimilation, and so on and so forth. So there's been social history of the Irish, the Italians, etc., becoming white. And on the same model, there is also the social history of American Jews, because this discourse is coming from the United States. So American Jews becoming white after the Second World War. Now, the curious thing is that among so-called white people, the Jewish group will still be identifiable. So this is not certainly the case of the Irish or the Italian, unless they self-identify as having Irish or Italian roots. But the Jews in the Jewish group will be will remain salient, will remain identifiable as Jews. So there's already a contradiction in
because it's I'm assuming it's because it really depends on who you're talking to, because this designation of Jews as white, as you just described, it comes probably mostly from left circles and progressive circles who associate, as you said, whiteness with domination and therefore is something worth fighting against. But obviously in other groups that celebrate whiteness, like white supremacist groups and neo-Nazis and very radical right-wing groups, whiteness is still an issue when it comes to the Jews, but from a very different perspective.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So for the alt-right, extreme right, Jews will never become white, for sure, because for them, whiteness is something very positive that Jews can never attain. Whereas for the left, the far left, if Jews have become white, it's a negative feature. So it's a kind of a double bind for the Jewish group. well, where can they situate themselves? Well, what is whiteness? What is non-whiteness? What is off-white? So in this kind of situation, when they are being criticized from both sides, it is a really particular and peculiar situation.
Sara, to what extent is it really rooted in the American discourse and modern American history? Because for me, as an Israeli, all this talk of whiteness actually feeds into a very different discourse, and that is Ashkenazim versus Mizrahim, right? But it seems that as an object of critique, of critical examination, this is something that is very rooted in an American tradition. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think one of the failures of the literature of the canon is that it is focused almost exclusively on the American case. So as you said, you can look around the world and there are these dilemmas about Jews and whiteness in many places. Now in both Western and Eastern Europe with, different political traditions there. South Africa is a very interesting case because Jews were juridically considered white people under the apartheid regime, and therefore the ambiguities about the status of whiteness and the association with the power structure or white supremacy there were almost obliterated because of the South African government's own decision of where white people sat. And other places around the world, certainly in Israel, the question of Ashkenazi versus Mizrahi, and the fact that today Israel is really what we might call in America a majority-minority country, where though the Ashkenazi power structure, remains sort of the idée fixe, I think, of the international community when it comes to what Israel is and what it represents as a kind of white colonialist regime. But certainly the literature is mostly focused on the U.S. case because of the politics in the United States and the original sin of slavery and how Jews fit into the American identity politics as kind of latecomers to the U.S., mostly as immigrants at the turn of the 20th century. And then their participation within the civil rights movement and solidarity on behalf of African Americans and the Black Jewish Alliance, or what was then known as the Black Jewish Alliance, has been very dominant in the way this idea of Jews and whiteness has been conceptualized.
What is it like in Europe, Balazs, where you are from and now partially residing? Do you see the debate there as in line with the American one, or very, very different?
Yeah, so this kind of framework of whiteness coming out of the United States is very powerful and influential, and it is supposed that it helps understanding different minority situation. Also, when there is no tradition of slavery, there's no tradition of black and white dichotomy. So all kinds of minority positions are being interpreted on the basis of this dichotomous black and white, including also the Jews. But then it also feeds into the post-colonial view, where you have the European traditionally white subjects, and then you have the colonial subjects who, although they live in Western societies now, but they are supposedly perpetuating the same kind of colonial situation. Like the white majority perpetuates this kind of situation for them, even though they are already in Europe, and they've been already in Europe for the last 3, 4, 5 decades. So I think it's also that detrimental. The white frame also detrimental, for example, in the interpretation of the case of the Roma in Eastern Europe, because it's not the same. It's not. It's a totally different social history, and when we try to interpret it in the black and white frame, we overlook a lot of different contexts and outcomes. So, but it's also detrimental for the Jews. So obviously, because it's coming out of the United States, it's influential, but epistemologically, for the interpretation, it's not really great.
I wonder to what extent is it really not a racial or ethnic or identity issue, but really a socio-economic one, that becoming white really denotes becoming middle class, and that whiteness or skin color or any sort of racial or ethnic categorization is just a straw man.
The problem is that there's an inherent ambiguity in the concept of white, because although the whiteness, critical whiteness studies frame will assert that they are taking whiteness in the sense of social history, assimilation, middle classness, and eventually also domination in a critical mode, right? So in the interpretive mode, it is being taken as a metaphor or signal of assimilation. In the critical mode, it is being taken as white people, people becoming white, therefore assimilating to white supremacy or even being the beneficiaries of white supremacy. And so when Jews are interpreted in this framework, it is certainly very bizarre, since the Jews have been persecuted for centuries in their previous European history. Which of course the United States, in the United States context, is totally different. It did not have this history. It had the history of black slavery. But then when Jews come to the United States and they are interpreted in this framework, it is not adequate. And then furthermore, it is being projected back into Europe, where it's even less accurate.
What is it like in the United States, really, Sarah, when really the Jewish American community has been overperforming in terms of political and financial power? How influential do you think really that is in determining the parameters of the debate?
Well, I mean, when I think about what Balazs was just saying, I kind of like to tell the story that when my grandfather showed up at Ellis Island, no one said to him, behind door number 1 is, the world of white supremacy. Behind door number 2 is post-racial America, and behind door number 3 is go back to Poland. What would you like to do? And it wasn't as if my grandfather, signed up for a future of being part of the white power structure and white supremacy. He was just trying to, get out of Poland and find a better future for himself and ultimately for the family. So I find it strange that it's framed as if Jews were, opting into white supremacy as part of their immigration journey. But certainly, one of the cruxes of the debate was that Jews, particularly those Jews who benefited from the GI Bill, were able to access opportunity and climb the ladder of American economic and educational opportunity in ways those with, immutably black skin would never be able to do, and do not benefit from at the same time. So there is a sense that Jews had a leg up in society that African Americans, despite having been there, much longer and having been persecuted and having faced many challenges, still were not able to access.
As Balazs was saying, I think a more adequate comparison would be Italians and Irish people, because they are, like the Jews, physically white, so the issue of appearances plays a minor role, and have also, to an extent, moved up upward mobility, in the sense that it allowed them also to integrate into the upper echelons of society. But still, the issue there is very different between Jews and Irish Americans and Italian Americans. How do you see it?
Well, I mean, first of all, Jews will never be able to assimilate because ultimately they're always the Christ killer. They're always, outside of the Christian power structure. So they can never contain this kind of second-class whiteness that white ethnics in America might be able to aspire to. At the same time, I guess historically, Jews had the most interaction with the African American community in urban areas, and were framed as the Goldberg in the ghetto, who was sort of what many African Americans felt was the most proximate form of white supremacy in their day-to-day life, and that created great deal of animosity. You think about James Baldwin's famous essay, Jews aren't anti-Semitic because because of Jews, they're anti-Semitic because they hate white people. And Jews were framed just as another form, or the most proximate form of white people that, those in Harlem saw in their day-to-day life. And that, I think, has had a profound effect on the way this has been framed going forward.
You think that is a very important piece
I think
by
so.
James Baldwin?
I think so. I think it remains so because it explains a lot about it explains a lot about the way Jews were understood. Not even though there's kind of an element of conspiratorial thinking there. He writes about, I don't know if all these, big corporations and major players in the economic scene in America are really Jewish, but to me, I thought they might be, and therefore that had an influence on his attitudes. At the same time, I don't know if we want to talk about it now. I think that Israel also played a factor in the whitening of American Jews, because there was already sort of this latent anti-white / Jewish sentiment that came out of the interaction in urban locations, but also increasing animosity on the eve of the 1967 war about the dominance of the American Jewish community within the civil rights movement, and a sense that it was, usurping the role or the authority of African Americans in their own liberation. And then along came the 1967 war, and this idea that American Jews were suddenly associated with this quote unquote white colonialist enterprise overseas, and this kind of boomeranged back on the American Jewish community in, further whitening them and making them more powerful than they had been before.
But actually, what you're saying now, looking at it historically, actually should serve the Jewish purpose, as it were, and give them more street cred among progressive circles, because they were, the Goldberg in the ghetto, and the alliance between liberal Jews and the civil rights struggle. All this should actually place Jews as the forefront of the battle against quote unquote whiteness, rather than the representatives of it.
Unfortunately, I don't think it really played out that way. In fact, it was seen more as American Jews overstepping their role, both in the leadership and financial, base of the civil rights movement, while, after the African American, struggle was moving more towards autonomy and even violence by the end of the 1960s as a path to liberation. And they were no longer interested in the kind of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and gradualist theories that have been promoted by Jews like Nathan Glazer. You think about Beyond the Melting Pot, or other Jewish intellectuals who really thought that the path to African American liberation could be the same as that of Jewish American liberation, when many African American intellectuals particularly thought that that was inconceivable and just the wrong parallel.
Yeah, I think so. The Jewish case could have served for the deconstruction of this fixed notion of whiteness. And if you think back to the original program of critical whiteness studies, it was just that: deconstruct whiteness, thereby relieving taking away its power, right? Just to say that whiteness is a historical construction, so let's deconstruct it, and then it won't have power over us anymore. And so the Jews coming to the United States and assimilating, and at the same time nurturing this kind of sensibility towards other minorities, helping the civil rights movement, and so on and so forth. And also by virtue of their special situation, social place in society, could have shown that the whiteness frame is rigid and it's not worthwhile preserving it. But the contrary happened, namely that the whiteness frame has become more rigidified. It's absolutely rigid, and so theoreticians wanted to place each and every group on the white or the black side of this divide. So it has become dogmatized. The black and white divide has become dogmatized and not deconstructed. So the contrary of the initial program has been realized.
But there's a downside to that deconstruction, and I'll tell you what I think it is. That if whiteness in a way is a choice, I mean, Jews have chosen to become white or worked towards become white, it means that they can also opt out of it. And I think maybe I want to ask you whether part of this animosity or resentment could be explained by progressive circles looking at Jews and saying to themselves, just like you opted out of whiteness in the 1960s by aligning with the black struggle, etc., and you're not doing it right now, whereas you could, because white people, of course, cannot opt out of whiteness. Black people, obviously, even more so, cannot opt out of blackness. But Jews have this agency that can be exploited and can be capitalized on, and because they choose not to, they are the people we are running against.
I think Jews made the American Jewish community, the organized American Jewish community, made a major mistake around the affirmative action debates because they decided to put themselves, basically aligned with, other whites and with white supremacy and thinking about themselves no longer as minorities, but as a kind of majority that should not benefit from the same preferential consideration in college admissions or in other ways that affirmative action has kind of spiraled into the larger DEI movement. So now it's very hard to turn back the clock on that because, this now has become institutionalized. It's a legal doctrine. It's all kinds of, social structures that are hard to reverse. But it was, I think that if that decision had not been made, then Jews would have more flexibility about where they would put themselves on this spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
But can we talk about the Jewish group as such? I mean, opting into whiteness, opting out of whiteness. I think there's also a kind of a methodological problem. Namely, what is agency? What is social causation? What is a sociological explanation? As opposed to opting into, which is a kind of a voluntaristic approach that somehow contradicts the sociological framework or the social historical framework.
Absolutely, the whole debate is problematic because you can also ask, who is the Jew? I mean, there are so many Jews There are very upper middle class Jews. There are very poor Jews. There are very powerful Jews. There are powerless Jews. The thing about Jews, in a way, is that they're at the same time a very powerful group and an oppressed minority.
This is probably one of the most heterogeneous groups.
Yeah. I want to go back to what you said, Sara. You mentioned Israel earlier with some apology, because obviously it's the elephant in the room. But there's other than the fact that Jews are associated with Israel and everything that Israel does somehow falls on them. But there's one more thing about it, and that is that recently the Israeli government has openly and flagrantly even aligned with white nationalist groups, and actually in your respective countries of origin, is perhaps the two best examples: the United States and Hungary. To what extent do you think that really is a factor here, and to what extent? I'm sure it's exacerbated things, but to what extent?
Look, to my mind, this started way back in the 1960s with the beginnings of transnational framing of the world and, the Black-Jewish alliance splitting in part over questions of third worldism and where were your alliances that, literally became alliances in black and white. So, the Jews went in one direction that they, for the most part, still in the 1960s, although obviously this has unraveled over time, stood in unanimity with Israel after the 1967 war. And all the other identity politics groups began to associate with the Palestinians and more largely Arab nationalism in the Middle East. And, here I think the paths began to diverge that also ultimately affected the path of the New Left and kind of mainstream activist politics beyond Black-Jewish relations. So I think that today's story, although, obviously exacerbated by the choices that the Israeli government has made, was set over 50 years ago, and I'm not sure that it's necessarily as determinative as it looks on the surface today.
Do you not think that it spurs people, critics of the American government, current American administration, into action? This that falls on the Jews, sadly, because it's their concept of protest against the politics that is dictated by the White House at the present moment, they associate Israel so closely with it, and some of it backfires.
Well, look, I think this is where American Jews find themselves in a very tricky situation, for example, with the debates about campus anti-Semitism and the role of the Trump administration with the universities today. But I think it's also a peculiarity of the American Jewish community that, Balazs can correct me from the Hungarian case, but I mean, I've certainly seen from other parts of the world that American Jews are constantly fixated on, what side of the political spectrum does anti-Semitism emanate from? Is it from the left or from the right? And most other diaspora communities have decided that they can look both ways before they cross the street, that anti-Semitism has no, one political home, that it exists across the political, economic, and social spectrum, and that essentially, you should be aware of all sides of the spectrum. And I think American Jews are still very much, partially because of Israel, but partially because of Trump, are still very much embedded in this, internal and really unhelpful and, in fact, I think quite damaging and dangerous conversation about, where does anti-Semitism emanate from within the political spectrum.
What is it like in Hungary, Balazs? I mean, what do you see as the hotbed of this discourse, this problematic discourse for Jews? The illiberal government, or perhaps some of the protest circles?
Yeah, just if I may refer back to
Sure.
the previous topic, that as much as, of course, right-wing anti-Semitism is dangerous and present, now anti-Semitism coming from the left is more prevalent. So, in a way,
You're talking in general or about a specific race?
I think in general, in the West,
Yeah.
let's put it like that. So because there are those kind of anti-Zionist movements that fuel, at the same time, anti-Semitism, because they, well, for a lot of reasons, maybe we can talk about this more in detail, but they are actually threatening Jews in the West, also, well, not only verbally, but also physically. We saw it on campus all over the place. So in this situation is not, it's not a miracle that Jews will say, well, this whole built up of, what came out of affirmative action and what was the main target of the left, which has become the DEI, that has always excluded Jews, right? So it's not surprising that they are turning against this, and they may even praise, somehow the attacks on the DEI framework, because that DEI and intersectionality and also critical race theory, critical whiteness have been turned against the Jewish group. So it effectively have become threatening. Now, for the Hungarian case, I think it's kind of interesting because, well, of course, Viktor Orbán is an authoritarian prime minister, and he's been ruling for 15 years now. And we know perfectly well that the Hungarian right has an anti-Semitic tradition, and especially the far right. And Orbán does represent the far right, but at the same time, he prohibited anti-Semitic discourse in his own camp. Why? Because he is trying to portray himself as the defender of the Jews. And how is he defending the Jews? By not letting immigrant refugees, especially Muslim refugees, into the country. So, in a way...
Do you think it's genuine, by the way? This change of heart on anti-Semitism?
No, absolutely not. So he can change at any time. He can change back to being anti-Semitic or letting his camp loose that will dwell again into anti-Semitic discourse. So this is, but now with his friendship with Netanyahu and portraying himself as the defender of Europe and European values against Muslims, right? It's a kind of a clash of civilization. And he kind of misrepresents Israel as also fighting against the Muslims as such. So, which is, of course, the same image that the extreme left has of Israel, right? It's only that the far right is praising this kind of Israel, that this kind of image of Israel, whereas the far left is criticizing
But
it.
the main problem is, if you ask me, is that Israel is playing along with it. That Netanyahu is, of course, throwing himself to that sort of framework that is so dangerous, both from Israel, but also for Jews abroad.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, but at the same time, it is in a way understandable that Israel needs allies. Israel needs allies also in the EU, also in the United Nations. So Israel could never really choose its allies because most nations, most countries have traditionally been against Israel and voting against Israel in the United Nations and the European Union. But then now, of course, it's been facilitated by the Netanyahu government also by way of having incorporated the Israeli far left in the government. So of course there's a kind of also natural affinity with the Orban government. So the other side of the coin is that there are so many Israeli tourists coming to Hungary. Budapest is full of Israeli tourists, and they feel safe. And this is also part of the reality what we are witnessing in Europe, that Israelis don't really want to travel elsewhere, or if they do, they don't necessarily feel safe.
Aren't there pockets of resistance to the government that bash the Jews for, the same way that it is in the United States and elsewhere in Europe? The saying that this alliance of Israel with the far right makes us, as left resistance fighters, whatever, bash Israel and bash the Jews as some sort of conduit to the government.
If there's any criticism of the
if there's any you're saying that Israelis feel safer in Budapest compared to other capitals in Europe, but I'm wondering whether it's because the prevalent mood in Budapest now is more or less what Orban represents, or that there are other pockets of criticism and resistance that just express themselves in ways that are different from what we see in the West.
I think it's very empirical. So you can go in the streets as Israeli and you can speak Hebrew and you can wear your kippah, and people are not going to be shocked. You can even outside of the synagogues, there's no, you don't have to have a specific fear because of wearing your kippah, for example. So it's not just the ambience. It's the reality. I think it's complicated. So the level of violence in Hungary is usually very low. This is also the reason why there's no effective protests against the government, which is a negative feature of the whole thing. But then, yes, there is criticism of Israel and aligning with the right from the Hungarian left, but Hungarian left is very small. And the problem with this kind of criticism is that it borrows a lot of elements from the Western left. And this kind of critique is sometimes exaggerated or unjust, or it's coming from traditional kind of anti-Zionism, which is not empirical enough. Like it should be more empirical. This is of course the thing, because otherwise it just feeds into what we know from the history of this anti-Zionism without a hyphen.
Yeah. So speaking of empirical, do you see, both of you, any sort of discussion that gets Jews and whiteness really for what it is, rather than just a stick to bash either the powers that be or the Jewish community or imperialism, oppression, who are seriously dealing with this issue in a neutral manner? Or is it just yet another political weapon, however you look at it?
I don't really see any of this. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I overlook things.
Well, you've been studying this issue pretty thoroughly. So if you missed it, then it probably doesn't exist.
I really think that the Jews, in a way, represent sort of counter-intersectionality. What do I mean by this? It means that Jews are white. They are supposed to be dominators. They all their positionings are being criticized, like objective positions. But also that their subjective grievances are being criticized. Right? The Holocaust memory also. The Jews complaining about anti-Semitism is being criticized because it is being said, oh, anti-Semitism is not structural, it doesn't really exist anymore. It is being just instrumentalized or weaponized by the Jewish community and also Israel, right? Same thing with Holocaust memory, right? Holocaust memory is being nourished for the impunity of the Jewish state, and so on and so forth. There's a discourse on state philo-Semitism, according to which Western states exceptionalize Jews in a positive way because Jews are being allied with the state. Again, they are being othered compared to other minorities. Other minorities are being oppressed. The racism is not being taken care of. Anti-Semitism is something the state treats as privileged.
Sara, what are your views?
Look, I'm not really a theoretician or an ideologist here. I guess I'm more, interested in the lived experience of Jews in the 1960s and 1960s and 1970s. What I would say is I think how they saw themselves in comparison or in relationship to the African American community and with the new kind of suburban assimilated world that they were living in. I would just say that I think that a lot of the hemming and hawing that American Jews are having today is kind of apocryphal in a sense that American Jews in the 1960s, I think, were a little bit more clear about what their roles were and what the possibilities were, and actually were more flexible and were more interested in the question of Jewish power and Black power than they are today.
Do you think it's down to political or intellectual leadership that is perhaps lacking today?
I don't know. I think it's just many of the things that emerged in the 1960s and 70s have now kind of ossified over the course of 50 years, and it's really hard to rewind the clock, or, there hasn't been enough creativity and interest in doing so. But I think it is really time, especially after October 7th, to be really litigating some of these questions. And that's part of what I think we're trying to do at the Conference Center, is to reopen this discussion.
Yeah, if I think about it, maybe Israelis are the adequate critiques of the Israeli government, like from the left, like the Israeli left, and the people who are in Kaplan and who know about what's going on, who know about the war. They know how the war in Gaza is being waged. So their criticism is much more empirical and much more to the point.
But the problem when it comes to whiteness is that they cannot be good at critique of something that they are unaware of. And as we said in the beginning, whiteness is not really an issue for many Israelis.
Yeah, but I think that's not entirely true. I think that the demographic realities of Israel, as not kind of this racial fantasy that the progressive left in the United States or in other places is projecting upon Israel as being this, white colonialist entity, when in fact today Israel is much more a, majority minority country. And I think the power of those constituencies to speak out both in Israel against, what they perceive as being the hegemony of Ashkenazi leadership, but also towards the broader understanding of what Israel is and what Jews are, is very important, along with the rising demographic of those who identify as Jews of color in the United States. I think the most recent survey, which just came out a few weeks ago, suggested that upwards of something like 15% of American Jews might identify as Mizrahi or Jews of color, and that also is a very important new part of this discussion.
Unprecedented.
Yeah. I mean, look, it doesn't change the fact that 85% of American Jews are of some, Ashkenazi heritage, but I think it does disrupt this understanding of what Jews and whiteness is and could be down the road.
Yeah, but does it really disrupt? So
I don't know.
No, because I have the feeling
it should, but maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely, it should. So because the Ashkenazi, the white case is being considered as paradigmatic, right? And they people either don't talk about the Jews of color, or if they do, they somehow want to extract the Jews of color of the Jewish community by saying that, well, they are victims of racism, right? So they are not victims of anti-Semitism, because they are being perceived as people of color, so just as the same as black or brown skinned people.
Yeah, I think that the bottom line of this discussion is that everything can be spinned against the Jews, right? In one way or another.
Yes.
All right. Dr. Sara Hirschhorn, Dr. Balazs Berkovits, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. That was really interesting.
And also many thanks to Itai Shalem, the manager of the TLV1 studios, and to the Compass Center for their generous support. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review, good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and now on Blue Sky as well. But most important, join us again next time for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.